The death of a child would be most parents' worst nightmare. No kind of physical or emotional torment could possibly come close to the excruciating pain of losing a child. And for doting mother of two, Mary Jean, this nightmare became a reality when her vengeful ex-husband, John Battaglia, viciously murdered their two daughters. Feeling helpless, Mary Jean could only listen as those fatal shots were fired. This heinous crime was the ultimate act of revenge from a spiteful, deceitful monster who would risk everything just to punish his ex-wife. Hey guys, welcome to The Final Feast. I'm Natasha Diamond. Today I'll be discussing the life and crimes of John Battaglia whilst also making his last meal on death row, which was chicken patty, mashed potatoes, country gravy, green beans, corn and cornbread. I hope I'm pronouncing his surname correctly. It is of Italian descent, so I did Google it and this is what Google says.
Battaglia.
So I hope I'm not completely butchering it, but if I am, I'm so sorry. This case is pretty heart-wrenching. As a mother and previous victim of domestic abuse, some of the parts of the case were pretty difficult to research. So with that being said, please read the trigger warning below and decide for yourself whether this is suitable for you. And with that being said, let's turn up the heat on John Battaglia. John David Battaglia was born on the 2nd of August 1955 to Catholic parents John and Julia. He was born on a military base in Enterprise, Alabama in the US. With his father serving in the military throughout most of his childhood, the family were uprooted several times travelling across the US and Germany. John Sr. eventually left the army in 1970. Throughout his childhood, John's mother Julia suffered from severe depression, alcoholism and mental illness. Tragically, she took her own life at Christmas time in 1972. John was an intelligent boy, and even with the trauma of losing his mother, he managed to graduate high school successfully and began studying at Fairleigh-Dickinson University in New Jersey. Initially, John applied to do a pre-med major in hopes of joining the medical field one day, but this dream was short-lived and he opted for an accounting major instead. Unfortunately, John ended up dropping out of university altogether in 1976 and seemed a bit lost for a while. He dabbled in illegal drugs and got into a bit of trouble before following in his father's footsteps and joining the military. John became a Marine and worked his way up to sergeant. Although seemingly successful in the Marines, John still longed to become an accountant and eventually he left the Marines to pursue this career. He moved to Dallas to be closer to his father and began night classes where he trained to become a certified public accountant. He also did some professional modelling at this time. In 1985, John met a woman who would become his first wife. Michelle Getty was a successful lawyer and mother to her 7-year-old son from a previous marriage. John seemed like the perfect package. He was tall, handsome and charming with a successful career, and the two of them hit it off immediately. Their relationship moved extremely quickly. They were married in 1985 and Michelle fell pregnant that same year. This was when the abuse began. At first, it was threats and intimidation. One day while they were travelling in the car with Michelle's son, John got angry at another motorist and reached for the gun he kept in his car. Of course, this scared Michelle, as it showed John's true colours, but at the time she was pregnant and felt trapped, hoping things would get better once the baby was born. Their daughter, Christy Battaglia, was born on November 1985, but things didn't change. In fact, they got worse. To Christy, her father was a good dad. They had a loving relationship and he would do all the normal things a dad would do. Once he even built her a Barbie house that she had longed for and expressed how happy she was with this wonderful gift. At this point, Christy wasn't aware that this kind and caring facade masked a cruel and cunning man that lurked beneath. Michelle sheltered Christy from John's many violent outbursts and threats as much as she possibly could. However, when Christy was still a baby, he hit Michelle so forcefully as she carried their child that it caused her to drop Christy on the ground. This was a turning point for Michelle, and she separated from her husband in September 1986. The separation only angered John. He began harassing and threatening Michelle to the point where she obtained a protective order against him. Still, he came to her house and hid in the bushes, banged on the windows, followed her in his car and even managed to tap her phone line. He would call the house and her workplace at all hours of the day and night. Sometimes he would make vile threats about how he'd kill himself and her, going into grotesque detail and how he'd use a knife to cut up her body. One night, early hours of the morning, Michelle awoke to find John in her bedroom, pushing her down by the shoulders, demanding sex. Of course, she refused, but terrified for her life, Michelle filed a police report about the incident. In retaliation, John contacted the law firm where Michelle worked and made false allegations that Michelle was having an affair with another partner at the law firm, claiming that she was carrying his child. John threatened to go to the press with this information unless the partner convinced Michelle to withdraw her statement to the police. Of course, no one believed him, but they did up their security measures and banned him from the office. After yet another incident in January 1987, where John tried to force Michelle off the freeway, threw a rock at her car and threatened her, he was arrested. He spent several days in jail, and the harassment died down for a few months following his release. However, this was short-lived, and eventually he became violent once again. This time hitting Michelle and throwing her down some steps on her way to pick Christy up. More charges were filed against John, and this set him to boiling point. He begged Michelle to drop the charges, but she refused. She was such a strong woman and adamant that she would not be intimidated by this man. For this, John felt Michelle needed to be punished, so later that day he approached her outside of her son's school. Smiling, John uttered the words, "If I'm going to jail, I'm going to make it worth my while," before striking Michelle multiple times, breaking her nose and dislocating her jaw. As she fell to the ground unconscious, John began kicking her. Onlookers called the police and Michelle was hospitalized. Following the attack, Michelle moved her family to Louisiana for her children's safety. John only had to plead guilty to a misdemeanor charge and was shockingly only given 2 years probation. In 1987, their divorce was finalized. A few years later, John met a woman named Mary Jean Pearl, and the two were married on the 6th of April 1991. Mary Jean owned a successful antique shop, and the two lived in a beautiful big house in Texas. The following year, in January of 1992, the couple had their first child together, a daughter named Mary Faith Battaglia, who went by the name Faith. 3 years later, in 1995, their second daughter, Liberty May Battaglia, was born, completing their family. Faith was described as a tomboy. She loved soccer and playing the violin, but hated wearing dresses. Liberty was the total opposite in that regard. She loved princess dresses and enjoyed ballet dancing. Both girls were said to be well behaved at school. As with Christy, John appeared to be a good dad, doting on his children. Christy stated that her father never laid a hand on her and barely raised his voice. He took all 3 girls out together for fun day trips, and they seemed like your typical, happy, blended family. Even at times when John would badmouth Mary Jean to those closest to him, he always spoke highly of his daughters. Behind closed doors, John spent the whole 9-year marriage to Mary Jean verbally abusing her. Eventually, this destroyed their marriage, and the couple separated in January 1999. On Christmas Day of that same year, John and Christy travelled to Mary Jean's house to collect Faith and Liberty to take them to church, as had previously been arranged. During the handover, an argument ensued, in which John couldn't control his rage and beat Mary Jean severely in front of all 3 children. This was the first time the girls had seen their father become physically violent, and they were petrified. As the children cried and begged their dad to stop, John pounded Mary Jean repeatedly on the back of her head, pulling her hair, pushing her to the floor and kicking her. When John was satisfied with the attack, he left the home that he had once shared with his family. Battered and bruised all over, Mary Jean dialed 911. John Battaglia was charged and convicted of 2 counts of assault and yet again only given, you guessed it, 2 years probation. Oh, and an $1,000 fine this time. Mary Jean filed for divorce the very next day, and good for her. She wanted to be rid of this man once and for all, at least for her own freedom. Unfortunately, the kids would still have to see their dad. However, this move was detrimental to today's case. John was furious. He felt betrayed and wanted Mary Jean to pay the ultimate price. The following Easter, Mary Jean gifted her stepdaughter Christy $50 for an Easter treat. For some reason, this enraged John. After the split, Mary Jean had set up an answering machine in the girls' bedroom so that their dad could leave them nice messages without having to go through her first. However, on this occasion, the message left was directed to Mary Jean, and it was far from nice. He said, "Mary Jean, the next time you give my daughter $50, why don't you tell her how you screwed her out of her college fund, you effing pig? How does that feel, pig?" She immediately alerted the police and John's probation officer, as this violated his probation. With a warrant now out for his arrest, this acted as a catalyst for the events which were about to unfold. On the 2nd of May 2001, John received a phone call from his probation officer informing him that there was a warrant out for his arrest and he would be wise to turn himself in. John was due to go for dinner with Faith and Liberty. Because he had never been abusive to his children, the courts had deemed him fit to have regular, unsupervised visits with them. He told the officer that he wanted one more night with his girls, then he would hand himself in. Unfortunately, the officer agreed to this plan. John met Mary Jean, a then 9-year-old Faith and 6-year-old Liberty, as arranged, in a shopping centre car park. Mary Jean was still terrified of her estranged husband, and I can imagine her children were too after what they'd witnessed, but she didn't want to defy the court order and reluctantly let them go. Mary Jean watched as John drove away with the girls waving to her in the back seat of his car. Instead of taking the girls for dinner, John took them back to his apartment in Deep Ellum, Dallas, instead. As Mary Jean headed to her friend Melissa's house, she received a phone call on her cell phone from her mom saying that John had just called her and the girls wanted to ask their mom a question. Mary Jean rushed to Michelle's house and called John. He answered, put the phone on speaker and directed Faith to ask her. Faith then asked, "Mummy, why are you putting Daddy in jail?" Before she was heard pleading, "No, Daddy, please don't do it," before gunshots rang out down the phone. A petrified and helpless Mary Jean could only scream down the phone in complete agony, shouting to the girls to run. After multiple shots were fired, John held the phone to his mouth and spoke the words, "Merry effing Christmas, Mary Jean," in reference to the Christmas attack of '99. After the phone call ended, Mary Jean dialed 999 before frantically flagging down a passing police officer in the street. When officers arrived at John's home, they found his youngest daughter Liberty lying face down by the front door in a pool of her own blood. She'd been shot 5 times, and it was clear that she'd tried to make a run for it. Faith was found lying face down in the kitchen. She'd suffered 3 gunshot wounds. Sadly, both girls were pronounced dead at the scene. John was nowhere to be found. As soon as he'd hung up the phone with Mary Jean, John had locked the apartment and went over to his girlfriend's house. The two went to a bar, then headed to a tattoo parlour, where John got a tattoo with 2 roses wrapped in barbed wire to commemorate his 2 deceased daughters. Police located his truck near the tattoo parlour and reprimanded John as he approached it. John wasn't going down easy, and a fistfight ensued, leaving him with a black eye. It took 4 officers to restrain him. Shortly after the incident, police confiscated 16 firearms from John's house. It was discovered that he had left an eerie message on the girl's answering machine. He said, "Good night, my little babies. I hope you're resting in a different place. I love you. I wish you had nothing to do with your mother. She was evil, vicious, stupid. You will be free of her. I love you very dearly. You were very brave girls, very brave. Liberty, you were also brave. I love you so much. Bye." The trial began on the 22nd of April 2002. It took only 19 minutes of deliberation for jurors to find John Battaglia guilty of capital murder. During the penalty phase, the defence called for a forensic scientist to testify that John shouldn't receive the death penalty because he suffered from bipolar disorder. She stated that when the murders took place, he was having a psychotic episode brought on by his bipolar. This causes some sufferers to become delusional and lose touch with reality. She argued that John wouldn't be a danger to the public if he took his medication. However, John Battaglia was found to be competent and held accountable for his heinous crime. He was sentenced to death. John's daughter Christy visited him twice in the 15 years that he sat on death row. She was only 15 years old when he murdered her half-sisters. On the 1st of February 2018, John Battaglia ate his last meal, a chicken patty, mashed potatoes, country gravy, green beans, corn and cornbread, before heading down to the execution chamber in the Huntsville unit in Texas. He was 62 years old. On seeing his ex-wife enter the death chamber witness area, he taunted her in his last words, "Well, hi, Mary Jean," before turning to the warden and saying, "I'll see you all later, bye, go ahead please." He was pronounced dead at 9:40 p.m. Faith and Liberty were laid to rest next to Mary Jean's dad. In light of their tragic murders, the Texas Family Code was introduced. This legislation states that in cases where there is evidence of domestic violence, the perpetrator may only spend time with their children through supervised visitation. In 2003, Faith and Liberty's Place was established. This is a safe space where families can spend their supervised visits. I'm really interested to hear what your opinion is on today's case. What I can't get over is how he was able to stalk, harass and viciously beat both his ex-wives and get hardly any jail time, just probation after probation after probation. Would a longer prison sentence have saved the girls' lives? I don't know, potentially. But at least now they have this legislation in place to prevent people like that being left alone with vulnerable children. Right. Let's take a deep breath because that was a heavy one. On your way out, don't forget to like and subscribe. Go and do something fun, do something that makes you happy, get some fresh air. And remember, enjoy every meal as if it was your last.